everyone. Welcome back to the Bruin Political Union Podcast. I'm your host, Mia Thorsen.
Hi, I'm Shannon Courtney. I'm the BPU Podcast Director.
We want to welcome you to the second episode of the Bruin Political Union Podcast titled Women in American Politics. In this episode, we are going to highlight the women's role in the United States modern political system from prominent grassroots leaders such as Stacey Abrams, prominent representatives in the House such as the Squad, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the historic percentage of women, especially women of color, in the 117th Congress. And today we are very happy to introduce Rohila Kusampudi, a fourth-year psychobiology major at UCLA, who is president of Ignite at UCLA, encouraging women to involve themselves in politics.
So it's been I'm so grateful to be on this podcast, and thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have her on to talk about the role of women in American politics. And before we start with different questions we're going to ask her, we want to give a little background on the role of women in history in American politics and also the historical percentage of women in American politics today. So obviously women have been involved in American politics since the beginning of the United States with, for example, creating the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls Convention and also running for president and different representative seats throughout the United States. So, for example, the first woman ever elected to Congress was in 1916. Her name was Jeannette Rankin, who served as Congresswoman to Montana. And this is very interesting because she was elected in 1916, which, despite women not actually having the right to vote yet in any states in the United States. So it has been over 100 years since the 19th Amendment when women received the right to vote and be an active participant in American politics. But however, in actuality, many women have not been afforded the opportunity to hold prominent positions within the United States political system. So with our most recent Congress, the 117th Congress in 2021, 144 out of 539 seats are held by women, which makes up a total of 27%. And this has been a 50% increase since the 112th Congress 10 years ago. So it's been definitely an increase. And for example, there are over 9 key congresswomen in prominent congressional positions, such as Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and 8 women that are on committee chairs in the House of Representatives and the Senate. We have also seen a rise in women in grassroots movements across the United States fighting for women's rights and fair and free elections against voter suppression, such as Stacey Abrams in Georgia. And furthermore, Joe Biden announced Harris as his running mate in 2020, and she officially became the first Black and Southeast Asian female to be the vice president in the nation's history.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. That was a very, very comprehensive breakdown. I'm going to go ahead and get into some comments and get Rohila in the mix for this discussion. So our first topic that I want to jump into is the role of women in American politics. And for the question, do you think the influx of female representation in key positions in American politics, such as Congress, grassroots movements, and now the vice presidency, will lead to different methods of leadership, the way the United States functions as a domestic and global superpower?
I think the recent influx is definitely encouraging, but it's always kind of sobering to think that we have so long to go. I mean, I remember reading an article recently and it said that it would take about 90 years for us to, if the current trends keep up, it would take about 90 years for us to reach like gender parity in Congress. And I still think we have so far to go, but I think the recent influx does change perhaps the issues that we brought to the government. I think women politicians or female leaders just play a much bigger role in caring about families, children, certain industries, reproductive health care. I think just having them at the table changes the conversation. And I think it also just leads to this really progressive cycle where you see more women politicians, which encourages more women to get involved, more women vote, and then more women run, and then it just continues. So I think that's really encouraging. And I think another thing you mentioned in the question was women of color specifically. Even for me as an Indian American, I've rarely heard of female Indian American politicians. There have been male ones in the past. There have been, luckily my generation is more lucky to witness Pramila Jayapal, people on Republican and Democratic parties, but it's been really valuable to see Kamala Harris at the position that she has been, to see Pramila Jayapal be a member of the squad that we were talking about. I think seeing Indian American woman for me personally is just encouraging and uplifting. And I know that members of other communities who identify with different races or even sexual identities would definitely identify with the diverse woman that we've seen run and win now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that is a really valuable point to bring up representation and how it matters, not just for women, but all denominations of women and people who identify as women. I think that's extremely important, and I totally agree with you.
And I think bring up the good point as that there's been this, I think, connotation in progressive circles that since the population is like the majority is women, for example, and there are significant minority communities within the United States, and so why aren't they receiving equal proportion in Congress in these prominent positions in American politics? And I think this maybe gives hope that it will progressively get better. But as you mentioned, 90 years, we do have a long ways to go.
Right, well, the only way we can start is now. To sort of transition into our next topic, which is grassroots movements and leaders, which we saw explode specifically within the last couple of years. Just to give some background on this question, many women have been leading key grassroots movement campaigns, such as Stacey Abrams in Georgia, creating the organization Fair Fight to, quote, ensure every American has a voice in our election system, which is something that we had previously seen a problem with, specifically in Georgia. We also have Heather Brown in Alabama, who started holding Handmaid's Tale-inspired protests in canvassing against Roy Moore's campaign for an Alabama Senate seat. And for those of you who don't know what Handmaid's Tale is, I definitely encourage you to check it out for some context. She was also empowered to run for public office to be a Baldwin County Commission's member after her leadership. So my question to you is, the role of women in grassroots movements has been indisputable in their effect on the American political climate. Do you foresee these grassroots leaders rising up to becoming traditionally elected officials in the future?
Well, I would say I hope so. I think the fear sometimes is that to kind of transition from grassroots to a traditional politician means more funding, which potentially could mean more lobbying, opening yourself up to special interest groups or corporations. And I think a lot of the public has such a distrust for that they prefer their grassroots politicians to be grassroots politicians because they fear that them entering the system is going to change their message, change their authenticity. And I think that's something I do understand and empathize with. I can only hope that we do encourage grassroots organizers to run, to seek that funding, but hopefully to find it in different sources. And I think so much of this relates to how we set up the funding systems for our government. I mean, it makes it really impossible for a lot of people to stay on message, to be authentic in the causes they support when it takes so much money to enter politics, and so much of that money lies in the wrong hands. And so I connect personally to Stacey Abrams a lot because I'm a resident of Georgia, and I remember voting for the last election, and it was really hard. Their website is very difficult to use, but on a deeper level, there's way more bureaucratic steps to getting your ballot. I remember having to make several calls. It came late, and by that time I had gone back to LA, gone back to Westwood for campus, and I was really worried that my ballot wouldn't reach in time. And for the congressional ballot race in January, I actually wasn't able to vote at all. Some problem happened with my ballot, and I tried calling. I was also busy with school. So this is something that really speaks to me. I think her work in Georgia was instrumental, even though there are still problems like I faced in January. But I think just the attention and the awareness that grassroots organizers can draw to certain issues is beyond the scope and attention, I think, of a lot of traditional politicians. And I think something else that grassroots organizers do differently is really go door to door and speak to people who feel like they have no role in the political process. I think just the image of traditional politicians is so, up in an ivory tower behind a wall that you can't access. And something about the messaging and the methods of grassroots really gets people out of their homes, out on the streets, or even online, just making that difference that we need to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, your story with your experience with your January ballot. I'm sure you are not the only person who experienced these frustrations, and I do think that that's a very important point to touch on. And another thing, I really appreciate you bringing up that disconnect, that financial disconnect between what we see in the leadership in grassroots organizations versus what we see in, like, quote unquote mainstream politicians. I think that it's also a wonderful point that you brought up, the mistrust that we see. And I think moving forward, it should really be about how we can shorten that financial leash that we have on grassroots organizations. And that's the only way we can sort of see a bridge between those two gaps.
I also think something that's prevalent to note is that a lot of grassroots movements now, like leaders in the United States, actually have, for example, more followers on social media than traditional politicians do. And I think that really shows that people have more trust in grassroots movements and they like authenticity in politics because now, with lack of term limits, for example, in Congress, people who are in Congress kind of have a false sense of what reality is. And so I think grassroots movements and these leaders are really showing people what they want to see. And so that's why they're following.
If I can add on to that, I think social media is a great sort of levelizer. There are issues that come with that as well, but I've personally seen, this rise in grassroots leaders on Instagram, which has been mimicked by traditional politicians who are now kind of scrambling to get a social media team together and try to kind of get their voice out on the same platform because they feel like they're being left behind. But even with those efforts, there's a sort of PR tone to their social media, which is just lacking the authenticity that grassroots leaders have. And so I think that's one area where you really see, even though social media is edited and it can still have that veneer or wall to it, you do see the more personal sides of a politician. And I think that is what makes it such a great leveling force.
Really great point.
Yeah, absolutely. To transition into our next topic, we want to touch on the Congresswomen and the team that has been publicized as the Squad. They have been some of the most outspoken and influential politicians on social media and faces of the progressive and feminist movements. So lately, we have seen a lot of political tension within the Democratic Party and within all parties, specifically here between key Democratic congresswomen such as Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Squad member AOC or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, due to differences in ideology, and this sort of discrepancy between the two has definitely gotten a lot of attention on social media. So my question to you is, should women in politics be mindful of how their disputes are perceived in the media and act with a sort of camaraderie, whether or not it be false, or carry on with the passions that we see sort of unbridled in their male counterparts?
I think I would rather politics be more honest than to have that veneer of camaraderie. In fact, I think the public is quite cynical about camaraderie and automatically identifies it as false. And I think it's no secret that there are disputes between, more moderate Democrats and more progressive candidates. And I don't think anything is accomplished by Nancy Pelosi keep having a sort of outward approach or appearance of friendliness when it's highly reported and huge sections of the public are not only knowledgeable about these disputes, but interested and want to see both sides really come out and talk about their opinions honestly, so that you can really decide for yourself. Um, I think so much of politics happens behind closed doors, and that's really detrimental to discussion and conversation. And I think even if it's a dispute or an argument, um, perhaps that can become an exchange of ideas that turns into something really productive. And I think continuing this kind of facade also it tells people that, there's no room for reconciliation. And if you open it up to discussion and it's honest, then people would see that perhaps there are compromises that we can make. And I think that is especially important in a institution as gridlocked as Congress is. I think any honest discussion would move things faster at a much better pace. And personally, I think the squad is definitely a media moniker. Like, I think it's taken on a life of its own. But, any friendship, political or otherwise, between women is always just nice to see, because there's always that image of, women as catty or not on each other's side. And to see that in politics is especially encouraging, because I think it's rarely talked about. I mean, female candidates who are running opposite one another are often compared by the way they dress or the way they look. And so there's this constant spirit of, competition and opposition. And so it's just nice to see, these ladies. And I think they added 2 members to the squad, if I'm not wrong, and one of them is a man. So it does go beyond gender, but the 4 original members of the squad definitely kind of define this sisterhood, which I think is really rare in politics.
Do you think, for example, with the mass news media about like infighting with Nancy Pelosi and AOC, for example, do you think that they're doing that? Do you think they would do that, for example, with male counterparts, with if there was a male Speaker of the House against more progressives, either Democrats or Republicans, and there was tension? Do you think they would be giving the same outcry in the news about bonding and they should be working together to their male counterparts in Congress?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think disputes between men, especially in the realm of politics, are often seen as intellectual, productive exchange of ideas. Whereas with women, I feel like sometimes women, and rightfully so, feel like they have to put on a veneer of friendliness and have to keep reassuring the public, this is just discussion, we just disagree on some ideas. Because if they didn't do so, it would escalate to this dramatized version of, these 4 women against Nancy Pelosi and they don't get along. And I absolutely think that men in the same situation would not be treated that way. And I think it would just be looked at with so much more nuance and maturity. In a world like politics, I can't imagine not having disputes or not having disagreements. And I wish there didn't have to be that veneer of friendliness. And I think so much of that does come from this fear of being perceived in a certain way, because it's happened to women in media for so long.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And my follow-up question is, AOC frequently uses Instagram Live as sort of a medium to speak to her supporters and others. And recently through Instagram Live, she revealed that she is a survivor of sexual assault. And as a woman, do you think that there is a stigma against women in positions of authority to be vocal about these issues?
Honestly, I think there's stigma against women in general, to be vocal about these issues. I do think that being in the limelight just makes that even worse, because suddenly your credentials, your opinions on unrelated topics are called into question. And what I really dislike is, I think there's this perception of either, you're doing this or you're speaking out about this to get some sort of reward or political gain or attention, um, which is just so bizarre to me because I think so much of the attention that has come to AOC's way after she said this was negative, and I don't think anyone would wish that upon themselves. Um, I think it is important, though, for women in those positions of power to speak out because um, they do, even though it is difficult to be in the limelight and to speak out about these issues, they also might be in a position of privilege in other ways, either financially or other forms of support that many women of low income status, for example, might not have access to. So they have it harder in some ways, I think, and easier in others. And if they take that step to talking about these issues, then it just encourages other women too. But I think it would be wonderful if, and perhaps it's the reason why we need more women in Congress, is if beyond the talking there was more political action. I do think that starts with talking, which is why it's so important. But I hope those voices build and lead to an actual, policy change or discussion of laws and things that you can see that are tangible, that actually implement changes.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you not sort of simply going off on the optimistic. I really appreciate you proving that AOC there was negative backlash and sort of the darker side of coming out with your experiences with sexual assault on a public platform. And I also really appreciate you drawing to attention the privileges that someone, maybe not necessarily AOC, but in AOC's position might have that other women who would otherwise be in similar positions don't. So I think that was an incredible point that you brought up. Absolutely. Okay. And into our next topic, Vice President Kamala Harris. So for some background, there have been many women who have run for president or have been considered vice presidential candidates, and however, obviously, none of them have been successful. The first woman to run for president was Victoria Woodhull in 1872, and she ran under the Equal Rights Party unsuccessfully. Shirley Anito Chisholm was the first woman of color to run for a major party's presidential nomination at the DNC, or Democratic National Convention, in 1972. And Hillary Clinton was the first woman to receive a major party's nomination for president. She was the Democratic nominee in the 2016 presidential election, where she faced off and eventually lost to Donald Trump. So Kamala Harris officially became the first Black and Southeast Asian and first female, a lot of firsts, vice president in the nation's history. So my question to you is, what do you think of the societal effects of Kamala Harris as vice president will be? Do we expect to see a permanent change in rhetoric surrounding the presidency like the second gentleman?
I think so much of what she is, just her identity, is revolutionary, and I think that is exciting and gives me a lot of hope. Like my answer to the last question, I do think it is like the best if that representation is followed with policy and tangible changes. But even her election is remarkable. As an Indian American, I remember how many relatives in the US and in other countries around the world were excited to see her win the nomination. And just looking at her history, reading up about her Indian American side and seeing where she came from. For the first time, my mom talked to me about me going into politics one day, just because she saw this and finally thought it was, something interesting. But to give her credit, she had never seen anyone in that position before. So I definitely think it just changes conversations. It reaffirms the idea that you can go into these positions And I think seeing her as a woman is incredibly powerful in this role. And even the title second gentleman, I think, is just such a shift in the way we think about men and women in the role of first lady. I hope that the second gentleman is still engaged in politics and sets a good example of what a good second gentleman can do and how supportive they can be towards their spouses. And so I think it'll just be interesting to see how all this pans out. um, I think even if you don't agree with some of her politics or policies, even if you're on the other side of the aisle completely, could see a lot of celebration of all these firsts. And I think something in that is unifying too. Even if you relate to her, um, not necessarily with some of her political ideology or policies that she has brought about in the past. If you can see the value in representation, then there's just a unifying aspect to that I think is very rare in politics nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. And as it is Black History Month, I think we would not only be remiss, but I think it necessary that we do make a nod to the Black women in America for making a difference in the 2020 presidential election for Joe Biden, as well as the Senate runoff races in Georgia. How do you think that this insurgence of activity from the Black woman demographic bodes for the future of American politics?
I think Black women are among the most silenced voices in America today. And, while we talk about all these issues during Black History Month, I do hope that we have that specific gender focus as well, because so much of those issues are left behind. Um, I think a lot about beauty standards in terms of society, but also how it plays a role in politics. So much of politics is about image, and to see Black women talk about beauty standards and what a role that has played and how they're perceived in the media, how they're perceived when they run as candidates. I mean, that's just one of many factors that they have to worry about and worry about in a very different way, from white women to women of other ethnicities. Um, to African American language is looked down upon. When you talk about, we were talking about grassroots leaders earlier, and many of them have talked about reclaiming things that um, belong to the African American community. And I think so much of the way Black women speak, dress, or look is just attacked, and that has a huge role to play in politics because, again, it is so much about image and the visuals. And so I think that is quite a tangent, I know, but I wanted to touch on, how such a tangential sort of issue relates to politics and how it affects how Black women feel when they go on that stage or when they put themselves out in public. So I do think that we have a lot of work to do in that regard, but it's been exciting to see how many more Black female voices are out there. um, I think, like we talked about the cycle earlier, hopefully it'll get more people to vote, to run. um, I think Stacey Abrams is a huge inspiration to a lot of people, and I still do hope that she continues working in politics and hopefully, becomes governor one day. I think there's still such a long way to go. There's still so many issues that we haven't even begun to discuss because we're still talking about, the most important ones. And yeah, we do owe, I think, a lot of minorities, speaking as an American, I do feel like so many people owe the Black American community and specifically Black women so much for their role in civil rights and advocacy over these years. I mean, so many rights and privileges that we have today come from those movements and from those leaders. So I think all power to Black women.
Yeah, I just want to make a special note that congratulations to Stacey Abrams for being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for her work the grassroots movements for Georgia. That's really amazing, and I think it's really great representation that even, for example, going back to the grassroots movement, that even though you might be stigmatized for being for working in grassroots movements or being a Black woman in general in politics, as we were talking about, you still have the power to make such an international difference.
Yeah, and I think one thing that has been proven time and time again, but was especially brought to light with this last presidential election, was how significant and so powerful the Black female voting bloc is, and how they really do, hold within them the balance. And I think that not only normalization of Ebonics and African American vernacular English, and maybe a shift away from Eurocentric, not maybe, definitely a shift away from Eurocentric beauty standards, should not only be normalized but celebrated. And I think that is something that can only continue to happen through leadership such as that of Stacey Abrams and Kamala and Michelle Obama and other outspoken Black women and Amanda Gorman, who is incredible. And I think that we can only see an upward trend. And yes, we do have that 90-year statistic, but I am really hopeful for a shift in future generations of the perception of Black women in politics. So again, another tangent. I'm sorry. So to close, I have one last question for you, and that is, what do you think is fundamental to know for women who see themselves having a future in politics? And what are some glass ceilings yet to be broken that you would like to see broken in the near future?
I think one thing that I would say is fundamental to know, this might sound like a downer at first, but I would say that, no matter how you speak or dress, you will be criticized. And so I would just tell women who are running to kind of try to disregard that as much as possible, because there's really no winning with how you present yourself. You will be called too bossy or too quiet, and there's really no winning with so much of the way women are perceived and talked about. And so I think some, like, people like AOC and some other politicians have kind of just abandoned a regard for that at all, and have just gone full steam ahead with what they believe in and what messages they care about. And that seems to be working better, even though there is a backlash to that. It seems to be getting the point across and the message across more effectively. And then some glass ceilings that I think remain are primarily in terms of funding. For example, with congressional statistics, there are certain grants that you can apply for if you're a woman running, that apply to the local level or the national level. But congressional funding for women who want to run is very limited. And there are other spheres where this counts as well. There are just spheres of politics where it's harder to have those resources. And because so many more women come from disadvantaged backgrounds or from economic hardship, it's hard to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just run for office when you have nothing to support you in that journey. And I think we would do better as a country if we really supported different voices in their fight to run and their fight to be representatives, with actual financial backing, because really just public support or encouragement does nothing when someone can't finance their run. And so I think that is one aspect of the glass ceiling that we're yet to fight, which is really large and broad, but just the general lack of access to financial resources, or a higher likelihood of economic hardship, I think really affects women's ability to run.
Absolutely. Another extremely well thought out and intellectual answer. Rohila, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to everybody for listening to us today. I hope you enjoyed what I really enjoyed as a wonderful discussion about women in politics. And Rohila, do you have anything to add?
I would just say it was an honor to talk about all these really important issues, and I hope the conversation continues. And yeah, on another note, I would just hope that everyone is staying safe during the pandemic and yeah, staying safe and happy.
So I want to say a big thank you so much for joining us and talking about the role of women in American politics. And lastly, if any listeners have suggestions for video ideas, what information you'd like to see, or what guests to invite for next podcast episodes, please contact the Bruin Political Union at bpu@g.ucla.edu. Thank you so much.